excellent report. We're very privileged to have someone with his expertise as the consultant on this project. And finally, and not least, Mark Thompson, our Deputy Research Director, for doing an outstanding job on the project, and especially in putting together a first draft for the committee's consideration based on Professor Eukins' report.
Yeah, no, I second all of that. I think that we are all indebted to Chris on this one. I learned more about government contracts reading his report than in all of my years as a lawyer. So I'm grateful for, if nothing else, I'm grateful for that.
Thank you.
Well, let's kick this off formally. Then we're gonna start just with a quick roll call. Before we even do that, I have to announce that the meeting is being recorded, so you are all officially on notice of that. And on that note, let's go down the roll. Aaron Nielsen, committee chair, is here. Chris Eukins, our consultant, is not a committee member, but is there as well. John Cooney.
I'm here.
Great. Robert Gerard. Muted, but here. Mohammed Mesbahi. Not joined yet. Jillian Metzger is joining us by phone. We won't be able to hear her, but she'll be able to listen in. Ann Joseph O'Connell. Hopefully she'll be joining later. Eloise Pasikoff will be joining us later as well. She's sent me a note to that effect. And then Jim Tozy.
Present.
Great. And then any other members whose name I didn't call? See, Mohammed just arrived.
All right. We also have a number of public participants. We're grateful to have them here as well. Just a heads up, the way that the process works is the ACUS members will have priority when we discuss. So, you know, if I were to cut you off, we welcome everybody's feedback. If I were to cut you off, that's why I'm doing that. I expect that we're going to have plenty of time for everybody to be able to share their thoughts, but that's just the way that it's going to work, is that ACUS committee members have priority for this process. So Matt has already shared his words of welcome. For those of you who this is your first ACUS meeting, I also welcome you. I mentioned earlier, before some of you were on, that we are guinea pigs. This is the first time in the history of ACUS that the entire meeting is online. In the past, we've had some members join online, but we've never done entirely online. So we're going to see how this goes. I'm optimistic. I think that, especially with Chris's excellent report, we can hopefully keep our conversation as close to natural as possible. But I do ask a favor of everybody, and that is, it's hard for me to know who wants to speak. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, on my screen, even if I see your picture, it's like 1 inch by 2 inch. And second, I don't see everybody's face, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. But it makes it hard for me to know if you want to speak. So if you want to speak, I ask that you, and there isn't just a pause where I say, does anybody have a thought? You know, then you can speak up just naturally. If you'd like to speak, there's a chat function on our software up in the right-hand corner. Just say, I would like to speak. And then that way I will know that you are in the queue and I can call on you. In order to make that process work, I ask that if you aren't asking to speak, don't use the chat function. Otherwise, I'm going to get lost who's trying to get in the queue and who's not. So I'm going to try to use the chat function as my line of people who want to speak on any particular issue. If that doesn't work, we're guinea pigs. We'll try something else next time. But I think it'll be easier if we do it this way, rather than me trying to guess if you want to speak or you waving your hands at me or something like that on the little tiny screen.
Which of the icons is the chat button?
It's like a circle, like a comic book thought bubble. So there's the two small heads that have the number of people. There's the wheel. In the middle of that, there's the chat button.
Got it.
So we're gonna try that, and just a little bit more of just kind of table setting before I turn the time over to Chris. So we have two meetings scheduled. We have our meeting today, which is scheduled to take 3 hours. We have our second meeting. Is it on the 26th, Mark? If I remember it correctly? You are on mute.
Hopefully the last time that's going to happen. Meeting is on the 27th. We're still trying to avoid Sunday meetings.
Okay, great. No, I'm with you on that. My internal calendar was off a day. So the way I imagine this working, just my preference, but we're flexible. We'll see how it goes. Is we're going to hear from Chris, who's going to give a summary of the project. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to open the floor for just some general thoughts from folks to see what they think about big picture stuff. We're not going to get into the preamble in today's meeting. We're going to save the preamble for the meeting on the 27th. And the reason is I don't want to spend a lot of time on the preamble until we have the recommendations, because the purpose of the preamble is to support the recommendations and not the other way around. So what we're going to do is, after we have some general thoughts, get everybody's kind of big picture ideas, we're going to turn to the recommendations and get as many of the recommendations done today as we can. Then between this meeting and next meeting, as necessary, we will adjust the preamble and have language that we will present in advance of next meeting in red line, so you can see what the changes are. And then we'll be able to talk about the preamble sensibly. We have a preamble now, so you kind of understand it, but I don't think it makes a lot of sense to spend much or any time on the preamble until we know what the recommendations are. So that's my kind of table setting for how this is going to work. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Chris. Then we'll have a general discussion for a few minutes of big picture thoughts. And at any point, if there's questions about technology, let us know, and we'll pause and get that straightened out. I want to make sure we can do our best to have everybody's participation in this unusual meeting format. So with that, I turn the time over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Mark, can you make me a presenter?
Mark, you are on mute again.
Hold on. I'm just making sure that Chris is a presenter. Chris, you should have received the notification.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Terrific. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting used to this application. So thank you all for joining today. We'll be talking about the draft recommendations from the Initiative Conference, and also we're talking about my draft report and talking more generally first about agency level bid protests. I want to give you a little background on my work in general. We're joined here by Susan Ebner from the Public Contract Law section and from other folks in the procurement community. In the federal procurement community, there are probably about between 500 and 1,000 procurement lawyers who are very active. And you'll just see there's also an international procurement community for the administrative law lawyers, and I think most of us are. One of the interesting things about this field is it's a very international field. It's a rapidly globalizing field. So I'm both a professor and a co-director at GW's Government Procurement Law program. Now the program is in its 60th year. It started in 1960. Two professors, Ralph Nash and John Savinik. Ralph is still alive. He's living in the Watergate and on the Eastern Shore. He's still quite active in the community. I regularly teach both nationally and internationally on public procurement issues, including issues like bid protests. I usually am working, for the most part, I'm working with U.S. agencies and with United Nations agencies doing capacity building. Probably the best benchmark we have of the size of this community internationally is that Chinese are certifying 50,000 people every year to join their public contracting workforce. And if you extrapolate from the Chinese population, the world population, we estimate somewhere between around 200,000, maybe 300,000 people are joining this community every year. So there are a lot of things that have to be done in terms of capacity building, done relatively quickly. And one of the important aspect of that is anti-corruption. The United States has a very strong interest in encouraging anti-corruption efforts in other procurement systems around the world. In allied nations, corruption and not having an effective bid protest system, for example, can be very destabilizing in our allies, which explains a lot of the work that I do with U.S. agencies in trying to do capacity building. There's a strong national interest in making sure these systems work. When I started teaching in 2002, there were really only two major programs around the world, one in Nottingham and one in Washington. And you can see there's been a proliferation of programs elsewhere around the world. The reason that we only have one program in the United States is largely because of internal law school dynamics, which Aaron will be familiar with. It's very difficult to get tenure lines for something as obscure as government contracts. And so we still have only one formal academic program in the United States. But in Europe, in contrast, and elsewhere around the world, there are a large number of programs that sprung up, and to a remarkable extent, there's uniformity across the laws. One of the side interesting thing that's happened during the COVID-19 pandemic is most discussions in procurement have assumed a common body of law and assumed that correctly from country to country, so that the solutions that are being developed internationally in procurement can be really very uniform across systems. It's fascinating to see how the law has evolved in parallel. I've just used my own statistics here, but we can do this for any of the professors in our program. This gives you an idea of how international the readership is. That's the big map, and the small map is the countries in which I've taught. Again, either with primarily through United Nations agencies or U.S. agencies teaching around the world. I made a real effort to make this project as transparent as possible. So I have a blog called Public Procurement International, and I put all the materials from this project onto that blog, and including when we had a public meeting with the ABA Bid Protest Committee, I put a recording of that meeting onto the blog. I put the background materials. Since this was originally composed, I put the draft study on it. So there's really been, in as much as possible, this has been a completely transparent process. Ironically, just for a little background, I actually worked back in the 1990s at the dawn of the internet. I worked with Jerry Walls, who was a senior and very respected member of the public contract law section. I worked with him developing the first website on agents of low bid protests within the public contract law section. And that's why the report is dedicated to Jerry Walls. Jerry was very active using electronic resources, using internet resources in helping knit together our community. So for those of you who are new to bid protest, there are three basic ways to bring a bid protest, and this is true really around the world. I worked for 10 years from about 2002 to 2012 on the United Nations model procurement law that's put out by the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. I was part of the U.S. delegation on that effort, and they were in many ways, because European lawyers dominated that process, in many ways they were mirroring what's going on in the European nations, and at the end of the day they ended up drafting a model law that looks just like our system. There are consistently around the world, there are three different fora that protesters can go to, that contractors can go to if they're angry about either about a solicitation before award, or afterward they can go to an agency, which is the agency itself, which is what we'll be talking about today, where they can go to an independent agency, such as the GAO in our country, or in the federal system, they can go to the Court of Federal Claims. So there's an agency, there's a protest to the agency itself. And by the way, you may have noticed in the report, if you look at the international statistics published by the World Bank, that channel is used predominantly elsewhere around outside the United States. Or you can go to an independent agency, or you can go to a court. This has been adopted. This structure has been adopted by the American Bar Association's Model Procurement Code, as well as the UN approach, and also it's reflected in the in the European Union's Remedies Directive, which was first promulgated in 2009. The Europeans don't call them bid protests; they call them remedies or bid challenges. And a tip for practitioners: do not refer to them as bid protests in China. It makes the Chinese cringe. Really, the interesting thing about agency level bid protests is that they started outside of formal process. They started informally at the Army Materiel Command and other agencies. And then they were part of a package of reforms in procurement that the Clinton administration put together in the 1990s, and President Clinton issued an executive order. And that's what launched the effort that Jerry Walsh and I participated in putting together information on the executive order and on the FAR provision, the Federal Acquisition Regulation provision that was published, and then there were agency-specific procedures. So what Jerry and I were trying to do was put all the information in one place for the American Bar Association in those early days of the internet. And those, since that time, since 1995, the agency-specific procedures have evolved. And much of what we try to do in this initiative, and much of what my report reflects, is an attempt to take best practices from the most evolved agencies and ask whether or not they could be applied on a government-wide basis. The structure, the conceptual structure for the report is built around an article that was done by Dan Gordon. He's a retired colleague of mine from GW. Dan was the head of the bid protest unit at GAO, very respected. He really made, in many ways, he made the bid protest unit what it is at GAO and in the federal government today. He was the acting general counsel at GAO. He became an associate dean with us, and then along the way, he was also the head of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy in the Obama administration. So a richly respected member of our procurement community, and he wrote an article on what the basic elements are of a successful bid challenge system. He wrote an article on what the elements are of a successful bid challenge system, and we always jokingly refer to this as a letter to Tanzania. The article is laying out the basic elements of what a good bid protest system should look like, and these are the elements that are tracked in my report. And the reason I mention the international aspect of it is I'm very conscious when we're talking about reforms to craft reforms that would be plausible in other nations as well, because in many ways the United States is a model or an exemplar for other nations that or other states in the United States, or even municipalities are setting up, for example, their own bid protest system. So I'm very conscious that what we recommend should make sense in other countries and other systems as well, because so many people look to the United States as a model in procurement. It's one of the interesting dynamics. The reason for that is because our procurement system is so much more advanced than other procurement systems around the world. And something we have to be very careful about when we're talking to, because otherwise we sound pompous and domineering. Oh, we're the best. It's because it's really an interesting study in administrative law and in the rule of law in general. Whereas our procurement law really started with the Revolutionary War, with the Continental Army. The rules that have developed, so for example, our termination for default rules were developed with Eli Whitney, who is a great inventor and a real scoundrel as a government contractor in the mid-1800s. Those rules were developed and they've remained intact because the rule of law has been respected in our country for over 200 years. So the rule of law creates this stabilizing box for the rules that carry and evolve over the centuries. And as a result, we have even though the French had a procurement system of procurement laws before we did, they had a revolution, which they had to start all over. And they had a much more disruptive political and legal system. Ours has been stable for over 200 years. And as a result, we've been able to evolve a system of rules that is really much more sophisticated. And that has strategic consequences. We're able to develop, for example, a system of procurement for high technology weapons, for advanced weapons that very few countries can do because they don't have the same legal structure to support that. So anyway, relying on Dan's basic conceptual outline, I developed a report, and then the ACUS recommendations follow on that. The first part of the ACUS report, of the ACUS recommendations, talks about why reasons that vendors might not want to use agents of bid protests. And I want to just take a quick step back here and talk about what I knew from my own. I've been a private practitioner. Besides being a professor, I'm of counsel with Arnold and Porter. I've been a private practitioner and then also Justice Department lawyer since I graduated from law school in '88. After I clerked from between '88 and '89, I've been in private practice and in government practice since then. So I've been immersed for 30 years now in government procurement practice. And I knew from my own experience that these things are true. And in many ways, the interviews that we had with private practitioners and with the government practitioners were elaborating on things that I'd already experienced. So the first concern among practitioners, and remember the important thing here is private practitioners counsel contractors on where to go for a bid protest. So the most important stakeholder is a person like Susan, who is counseling private contractors on which channel to use, agency level bid protests, GAO, or the Court of Federal Claims. And the lawyers, if they want to maintain a good relationship with their clients, will not recommend a high risk channel. And the agency level bid protests at this point are viewed as a high risk channel. As an example, I was representing a contractor in late 2002 that made body armor. And at that point in late 2002, you could see the invasion of Iraq coming. The invasion of Iraq was in March 2003. We brought an agency level bid protest at the Army Material Command challenging sole source procurements. And we remember the Army Material Command was the home of agency level bid protests. It's really where they started before Clinton issued his executive order. And at that point, the Army Material Command was bent on just winning the bid protest. And so we went in there and we tried to explain what was happening was the AMC was procuring body armor on a sole source basis, ramping up to a major war. And we said, this is crazy from a policy standpoint. This is so dangerous for our soldiers that you're really encouraging a sole channel of supply. You have to have multiple sources of supply because we're about to go into a war. And the response from the AMC was, well, we beat you in the bid protest. We're going to kick you out. And my client turned to me and said, why are we here? Why did you put me here? You're wasting my time. And from that point on, I would never counsel anybody to go to an agency level bid protest, because even though we went to the historical home of agency level bid protests, the agency counsel was just bent on winning. And that's really been the experience of many lawyers. Many practicing lawyers will not counsel their clients to go to an agency level bid protest process. Conversely, though, when you talk to, I've trained government contracting people over the years, and we sit in a big room and we'll go through a sort of a war game. What is the best possible outcome for a government contracting person in terms of bid protest? Answer is agency level bid protests. The government contracting people inside the government and their lawyers, they want the protest to go to the agency level process because they can control the reputational and the programmatic risk that surrounds the protest. They far prefer if the vendors would go to the agency level protest. So while government lawyers favor them, government contracting people inside government favor agency level bid protests, it's been a procedural problem. There's too much risk in the current procedural structure, and there's a perceived need, therefore, for reform. So the risks that the ACUS recommendations, the prefatory language identifies is a perceived bias, a perception that the process is opaque with uncertain timelines, that there's no required production of the administrative record, and there are too many procedural sand traps built into the agency level bid protest process. These are the things that would have to be fixed in order to make agency level bid protests, which are good for the government community because they reduce costs and risk, and they're good for the vendor community because they also reduce costs and risk. Remember, there's a lot of reputational risk that the vendor suffers. When the vendor protests against the customer, the vendor creates a very angry customer. So the vendor would prefer to use agents level bid protests as well. Both sides would prefer to have this process work, and the question is how to make it work. The draft recommendations track from the draft report. The draft recommendations would be identification of the decisions not subject to agents level bid protests, and Aaron will be walking you through these in more detail. But as Susan and others will attest, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now regarding new types of contracting vehicles, some of which are referred to, for example, as other transactions. A lot of uncertainty about whether or not these other types of contracts are going to be subject to bid protests. To the extent that they're not subject to bid protests, there's a risk. There's a risk for the government because, in essence, the vendors who are bringing bid protests are the world's best whistleblowers. They're in the process, they're invested in the process, and they're bringing a big challenge to point out problems. If there are classes of transactions that are outside the bid protest process, that is viewed by many, including myself, as a material risk to the government. So the ACUS recommendation would be to create a negative list. If agencies are going to exclude certain categories of contract from the agency level bid protest process, the agencies have to be proactive and actually name them, which would be create some administrative and reputational risk for the agency. There should be transparency of the process and the personnel, and the agency protest official is something the GSA already does and that other agencies really like as an idea, as a way of bringing structure to the agency level bid protest process by having somebody named as the agency protest official. Having clear notice of the timeline so that the vendors know exactly where the bid protest. Very oftentimes vendors will just submit an agency level bid protest and then everything will go dark. They'll have no idea what's going on. They want clear notice as to when the process begins and when it ends. In many ways, this can be done by cross-appropriating the procedural structure used for claims, for post-award contract disputes. Just taking that process and applying it over to bid protest would solve that procedural sand trap. Compiling the record and making it available, that would mean compiling the record to make it a record similar to the one compiled for GAO protests, making it available to the extent possible. And Mark and I have talked about this at length. This is really hard to make a subject of regulation because the technology is evolving really quickly. There's a part of the open government initiative that's covering government in general. A subpart of that is open contracting. There is an open contracting protocol that's being adopted by the US government, by other governments, that will make contract materials, make the administrative record in bid protests, make them readily available to the public. So as a practical matter, these records will be public anyway in 20 years. Right now, the reform would be a matter of admonishing agencies to make them more available. Procedures for apprising the parties of the status of the agency level protest goes back to the point that the parties, the vendors, need to have a clear sense of where the protest stands. Protecting its adverse consequences is really a matter of maintaining the status quo. And in the UK, if you bring a bid protest because of a procedural anomaly there, your bid protest may take years to resolve in the courts, but you can get anticipatory profits. So you can get millions of pounds in damages in a UK procedure because you've lost. These are the anticipatory profits on the contract that you've lost. In the US, really, what you get in the US is you get a chance at a recompetition. So if that's the only real reward for this whistleblower called a protester, if getting a chance at a fair recompetition is your only reward, it's very important that we maintain the status quo, that the contract be stayed and the status quo be maintained so that the whistleblower has an adequate incentive. Because if we destroy the status quo, if the contract is allowed to proceed during the pendency of the protest, if we destroy that reward, then the whistleblower won't bother to come forward and the entire process will collapse. Or alternatively, we'll have to pay the whistleblower things like the Brits do. We have to pay them anticipatory profits. And as a nation, we've never done that at the federal level. We believe instead we just want to maintain the status quo. The last is publishing the data on agency level bid protests. And this would be a matter of, so for example, right now, Amazon and two other, Overstock and Fisher, There were 3 contractors who were just awarded a $6 billion shared contract so that Mark and others will be able to make purchases. As government officials, you'll be able to make purchases up to $10,000 using a government purchase card. You'll be able to make a micro purchase up to $10,000 off Amazon, and that'll occur within the next 3 weeks, I think. It's 30 days from June 26th. So you very soon will be able to use Amazon on a regular basis as a government official. The problem is that during the course of that very important procurement, you can see how important it is to you as individual officials. There were agency level bid protests that people only heard about through a hearing process on the Hill. And really, there should be more transparency. There were GAO protests, and those were public, but the agency level bid protests that attended that very important procurement were secret, and that's a bad idea. So there should be transparency during the pendency of the protest, and there should absolutely be transparency at the end of every year, much as GAO provides year-end statistics, so that folks can begin to regain faith in the agency level bid protest process. This entire initiative is about restoring public faith in agency level bid protests. Publication of data would be an important step in that direction. And I'll close there. Mark?
I think, Aaron, next steps here. Aaron, you're on mute.
You got me.
Turnabout's fair play.
Now we're even. So that was an excellent summary of the big picture of what we're trying to do. I see in the chat that John has some big picture framing thoughts as well. So I'll let John have the floor.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Professor, for such an extraordinary report. It's up to the quality of all the things that we've seen come out of GW on procurement over the years. It's what a machine you all have established over there. I've got 2 points that I'd like to get some clarity on, if I could, just big picture items. The first is, I think we're talking about a subset of vendors, aren't we, that might consider using the agency level protest. My understanding is that incumbents generally don't go this route because they may think they're better off going to GAO and getting a stay, and so they can continue working during that period, and they have a reasonably good chance, south of 50% somewhere, but pretty good of getting some kind of corrective action out of the GAO process. But
yeah, that's.
And a couple others just with that. My understanding is that this is very useful for small contractors, an entity that might not have the resources to be able to go through a GAO or, God forbid, a court of federal claims process. And that the process can be particularly useful in a pre-award protest setting where there's something wrong with the terms of the solicitation, what was going to be required to get the award. If there's something bad about that, the contractor might be able to take that up earlier and help itself compete, but also help the agency from making a mistake. But beyond that, it's really the people like the way you described it. It's people who don't want to rock the boat. They want to maintain a good relationship with the agency. They may be back before that contracting officer. There may be other work in the pipeline that they'd be able to compete for, and they want to stay on good terms. So that's one whole part of it, to get a sense of defining the contractors who might be interested in following this pathway. And the second comment goes back to another point you made. I wonder if the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the FAR Council have a role in doing this, a role in what the agencies who might be interested in adopting some of your recommendations, whether the FAR process is an obstacle that has to be taken into account and considering whether that can be accomplished. Those are my 2 comments.
So, to walk through, I agreed with everything that you said, except about that who the likely protesters are. Both large incumbents or incumbents in general, and small companies could very well use agency level bid protests. The incumbents will want to maintain a good relationship with the agency, and so they're more likely to. They would like a good and effective agency level bid protest process. And there's a nuance here in terms of your focus on pre-award as opposed to post-award. Pre-award, because there's really no proprietary data, there's no bid and proposal information out there because the bids haven't been submitted. That's the best time for an agency level bid protest, because then you can have an open discussion about the solicitation terms. The agency won't necessarily disclose its internal source selection information, but you can have a very wide open discussion without a protective order, at least about the terms of solicitation. So a system that doesn't have a protective order, which is what an agency level bid protest system is, works better in the pre-award. You've asked a completely different question regarding what the likely steps are for reform, and I think it's an important question, so I could walk through it with you. So,
Briefly,
I'm sorry?
Briefly, I agree. We want to hear the steps, but I also want to get to the recommendations too.
Okay, very good. So the likeliest way forward on this is to go through the National Defense Authorization Act process. As Susan and others would tell you, that's the best way to get reform effected, and that the Office of Federal Procurement Policy would be directly involved in that. We have close ties as a community with the House and Senate Armed Services Committee staff. Title 8 of the National Defense Authorization Act every year. Susan works on this regularly, putting in ideas into the National Defense Authorization Act. If there's consensus in the community on going forward with reform, and I think there should be, it would be a question of asking the staff of the House Arms and Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, to include this in, it'll probably be the NDAA for FY21. The administration always has a say on what goes forward at that point, and the Office of Federal Procurement Policy will be directly involved. Matthew Blum is one of the leads in the OFPP. He and I have known each other for 20 or 30 years. I would be working closely with Matthew to make sure that he's comfortable with what's happening. The admonition would come from the Armed Services Committees to the FAR Council to take up this issue. It would be a very short provision in the National Defense Authorization Act. If we shortcut it and we go straight to the FAR Council, it could just disappear. It's for issues like this where there's consensus that reform is a good idea, but any individual stakeholder doesn't really have enough of a stake to step forward. Usually the prod has to come from above.
All right. Do we have it before we start going to the individual recommendations? Would anybody else like to chime in with some big picture thoughts? I didn't mean to cut you off, Chris, but I'd like to make sure we get to the recommendations. Okay, with that, Mark, can you please bring up the recommendation 1?
Absolutely.
Okay, and let's just pause for a second for some of you who have not been through this process. The way this is going to work is we're going to go on a recommendation by recommendation basis, and we're going to essentially take what we have and revise it in real time. Mark will be running the computer, and so if you have thoughts about the language, obviously big picture thoughts are welcome too. Make sure we're going the right direction. But it'd be helpful if you see specific language that doesn't do the trick, that you have some language you can propose, and then Mark will write it out there, and if we like it, we'll keep it. If not, we'll undo it. But the process here is going to be very text focused, and one of the benefits of ACUS is we have a lot of institutional knowledge and thoughts in the room, so people will identify unintended consequences and things of that sort that the language that we propose might present. Here, I'll speak for myself. I don't claim a great deal of knowledge about the government contract process. I learned a lot from the report. I have a little bit of background. So I'm going to lean heavily, obviously, on the team here. If you see things, speak up, and let's see, what we can do here to avoid making a mistake. So with that, let's look at recommendation 1. I will read it, and then I will ask if anybody would like to chime in with some thoughts. Agencies should clearly identify which of their procurement decisions may not, I wonder if this is the first italics in a recommendation, be made the subject of agency level protests. So far as feasible, agencies should allow agency level protests concerning any of their procurement decisions. And with that, does anybody have thoughts? And if so, just let me know in chat, and then I will turn the floor to you. This is where I miss being in person. I like to think I can read the room, and I know that somebody has a thought. Anne has just pinged me. Anne Joseph O'Connell, will you please take the floor?
Okay, I'm not as familiar with GoToMeeting. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So is the goal to have, as the presentation suggested, buckets of decisions that would be identified before any particular decision? Or is the goal that you would identify when putting out something for bid that this is not, or or some other procurement decision, even if it doesn't go out for bid, because I guess those are the fuzzy categories, that this would not fall under these procedures? I guess I'm looking, is there going to be a general policy, or is it step by step?
It would likely be so the answer to your question is it'd be a general policy. It would go through, you'd have a federal acquisition regulation provision that talked about the fact that presumptively everything is subject to agency level bid protest. That would be an amendment to FAR 33.103. And then agency, if they wanted to exempt certain classes of acquisition from agency level bid protests, they would publish a supplement to their agency level supplements to the that FAR provision.
Eloise?
Okay, this is also my first GoToMeeting venture, so did I successfully turn my microphone off? Okay, great. So this is a really minor question, but it kind of is about the phrasing of all of these, and it tracks my confusion at the in lines like 60 to 65 of the preamble still. I was getting lost in which recommendation is supposed to be for whom, and I remember from my last ACUS experience that we like to be very precise when we're giving instructions as to whom should be doing what. And so I just wanted to make sure as we walk our way through these recommendations that every time we say agencies should, we want to make sure that, because I was a little confused, Congress could do all of this, but GAO could do one of these, but agencies could do some, and they could do it here. And now we also just talked about OFFP. I think that's the name of it, whatever, OFPP, that we are just being really precise about who's the actor, who we mean here. So if it's agencies and if it's correct throughout, that's great. I just wanted to pause for a moment before we unleash all of the recommendations that we've got the right actor. And also sort of to note my confusion with that part in the preamble as it's heading us into the recommendations.
So Mark, can you show us that section of the preamble real fast so everybody can see the language? I said we weren't going to talk about the preamble, but this is directly relevant to
sorry about that.
No. I'm with you 100%. So this is how we defined it. Where's I'm looking at the what's the line? Oh, here it is, line 63. Each recommended change can be accomplished by legislation. The recommended changes directed to GAO can also be accomplished by amending GAO's own regulations. And then the recommended changes directed to agencies can be accomplished either by amending the FAR or by their own protest procedure. So we struggled with this in the framing of the recommendations because we are speaking to multiple audiences at once, and we didn't want to have 39 recommendations rather than 13. But maybe we didn't accomplish that. So if so, first of all, are other people confused? And to the extent that I suspect people are, what language should we use either here in the preamble or in the recommendations to alleviate that? I wish I could take a poll. In a law school class, I have the ability to take a poll of the students and see where people are. I don't have that ability here. But if you are confused by it, just say like a yes in the chat function, just so I can get a feel for where people are. Plus, we can experiment with our chat.
Just to be clear, it's not so much that I was confused about the agencies should. I just wanted to double check that we all felt confident that given what we had said in the preamble about multiple sources of actors, that we all just felt good about using agencies should here and elsewhere.
That's right. By agencies, the way that we did it in formulating this is the default was we were just going to talk about agencies, but Congress or the GAO can always do it too. That's the language we were trying to accomplish up there. But rather than, like I said, doing it 3 times, we just said we would just say agencies with that as the default understanding. I think I understood it, but I want to make sure that people do. Anne, I think you're raising your hand.
I think, I mean, I also have some of the confusion Eloise has, and this is not an area of any expertise of mine, and I apologize for taking time on it. But going back to my question, just to make sure I'm clear, kind of combining my question with Eloise's, is that the idea is that there's the FAR, that's not one agency, but each agency under the first recommendation would then establish a general policy which it would publish that is kind of specific to that agency about kind of what falls in and what falls out of their own procedures for challenging a decision. Is that right?
Yeah, the FAR covers all the executive agencies, and then the agencies can publish their own regulations under that, in a FAR supplement. The FAR supplement has to be consistent. Although the agencies can engage in some deviation from the FAR, at the end of the day, the FAR Council has the power to reach in and force the agencies back into the mother document, into the FAR, if necessary. What's happened as a practical matter since 1995 is that individual agencies have promulgated their own procedures for agency level bid protests to supplement the FAR 33.104. This would, if by setting this as an affirmative, by saying that presumptively, in this particular recommendation, everything is going to be covered, the agency would have to
make sense to me.
Yeah.
So with that explanation, do we think that, one, it works structurally, so we actually can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, and assuming that it does, do we think the language that we have does it, or do we need to tweak the language? I think it does. I understand it structurally. I think it does make sense. I don't know if the language we have does it. But maybe it does. I'm not hearing any.
So coming back a third time, if we're talking about general buckets identified in advance, there is some ambiguity in the language because it says which of their procurement decisions, which could suggest that individual decisions they're going to identify at the time. So I don't know if we want to say types of decisions.
Yeah, Mark, can you scroll down to recommendation 1? Yeah, I agree with that. So this is my thought. Let's put a pin on the other subject of does this do the trick for covering the 3 different types of folks. Before next meeting, we will visit that language and we'll see if it does the trick, and we'll talk about that next meeting. So now let's assume that we can do all 3 at once. Let's talk about the specific language. As to Anne's point, I think that's really helpful. I think we should say categories. Which categories of procurement decisions may not be made, because otherwise it'll be done on an ad hoc. It sounds like it may be suggesting an ad hoc basis, which I don't believe is what we are proposing. And does anybody else want to chime in?
Do we want to have a preceding sentence that just says as the default that most types will be made? It just seems a little odd to start with the carve out, as opposed to like setting the general default, which it sounds like we approve of.
We do approve of that. I thought that by setting the carve out, that was implicit, but I see your point that there's no need to be implicit when we can be explicit. So what would that sentence look like?
Oh, something like agencies should continue to operate under the presumption that in general, all types of procurement decisions may be the subject of agency level protests. That's clunky, but that's like the.
I like that, though. A friendly amendment would be to, let's get rid of the word, get rid of continue.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's in fact accurate.
Right.
And there's no reason to put it in there. Agencies should operate under the presumption that, in general, all types of procurement decisions. Chris, is that accurate, helpful, or are we walking into quicksand here?
I don't think we're walking into quicksand. I think that that some people, some agencies might want to take some types of procurements out of the agency level bid protest process. That's still a point of dispute and debate. And the way it's framed right now, Aaron, the agencies retain the prerogative to do that if they want to.
Okay. Susan.
I have to figure out how to unmute myself. I would add to what Professor Eukins has said that when you talk about all types of decisions relating to a procurement, it could include many things that are deliberative process, such as whether or not something's going to be sole source. That would be protestable, but other implicit issues within it might be things that are purely within the agency's discretion. So I think I agree with him, it's too broad.
Is it too broad even with the language in general, which allows them to not follow it in specific instances? And assuming that that is too broad, how would you narrow it? Again, Susan, I welcome your wisdom here.
Yeah, I'd have to think, let me think about that a minute.
Sure.
I mean, I would basically say any type of procurement decision that could be protested at a GAO or the Court of Federal Claims could be the subject of an agency level protest. I would circumscribe it to what you could raise at those other forums.
Okay, so let's say all types of procurement decisions that, so to go before the may, all types of procurement decisions that could be the subject of a bid protest at the GAO or in court.
Or maybe the Competition and Contracting Act or Tucker Act. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, what Susan's doing is she's guiding us past what could be a point of some contention. If there were the new procurement, let's say new procurement method is invented tomorrow, which is entirely possible. What Susan is saying is you're drawing on the established precedent of GAO and Court of Federal Claims to draw the boundaries to what's subject to an agency level bid protest. If we didn't do this, Aaron, and we left everything open, which would be that would be my personal preference, it's much more likely to excite some heated contention, some heated opposition from, for instance, in the other transactions I was referring to before, the military services sometimes cherish those because they're arguably protest free. So what we're trying to do here, what I was trying to do in the starting point was to create a presumption across everything. Susan is suggesting a way to avoid the political pitfalls of making everything presumptively protestable.
Well, and even beyond the political footballs, I think that would be almost beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. I don't think we're trying to make agency level bid protests like an entirely different animal than the other types of bid protests. We're just trying to make it equal with the others, so it's an equally valuable tool. So I'm inclined to follow Susan's limitation on that, to the extent that this language does it. Do you think this language does the trick, Susan?
Hello, this is Judge Braden. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on an island.
Oh, great.
And I can't always get good reception. I've listened to part of what you've been doing. I don't mean to get in the middle of this. I was very much involved with the study that was done by RAND, as you recall. And I think one of the, let me just back up on a big picture thing here. Obviously, DOD is very concerned about having any more delays in the procurement process, and they're going to be the biggest hammer in all of this. So the issue is, are you focusing this on DOD protests in addition to other agencies, or do you want to carve out DOD stuff? That's one issue to think about, because the people that are going to oppose this are going to be the defense community. They do not want to have any more. They would prefer not to have any bid protest, period. They're certainly not going to want to have another layer. That's one thing to think about. The second thing is that, and obviously, there were riders 2 years ago on the defense appropriations bill, basically to substantially lessen the jurisdiction of the Court of Federal Claims. And I was able to stop that by getting a provision saying everything would have to go through the Judiciary Committee first, so that it put a kibosh on that. I don't know that the court in the future will have the ability to do that, but I think you need to think through really what your constituency for this is going to be, and who your enemies are going to be in doing this. I think you can do a lot of good by carving out DOD for starters, and because that eliminates a lot of opposition. And then the other thing is, you want to do this for a certain size of bid protest. Presumably the function of the agency level protest really would be to handle those of a smaller size that are typically presented to the GAO or the Court of Claims, kind of like a small claims resolution. And then the issue is whatever they're going to do, is it binding, or is that issue just another level of review? To me, for a small person, I think it's better to say, look, this is your shot and it's binding, and it precludes you from the other two accesses if you choose to do it, and that way you get an answer and it's over with. So that's a lot of different stuff I'm throwing out, but I think it goes to you want to identify what your agency level protests are going to be, and I think you have to think about where the people that want this probably are going to be people that are small, I suspect. And they don't want to spend $100,000 or more to go to GAO, and certainly they don't want to spend $250 or more to go to the court. So I'm giving a lot of stuff to think about. But
Sure.
Maybe you've done that in the pre-log. I've been able to get in and out of this according to whenever the satellite goes over.
No, I understood. This is very helpful. This was not covered before. But it is, I think it's worth talking about. Chris, do you have a response?
Sure. Well, I think Judge Braden's concerns about the perception from inside the Defense Department that they don't like the disruption of the bid protests is certainly true. The National Defense Authorization Act a few years ago called for the RAND study, didn't name RAND, but it called for the study that the RAND Corporation did. And what was interesting, and that study is cited extensively in my report, what was interesting about that study is that RAND Corporation came in and their researchers said, there really isn't the disruption that the Defense Department folks think there is. There's a very, very small percentage of procurements that are actually protested, and the perception of disruption is overstated and overblown. So it becomes the challenge in reform or discussing bid protests in general is to say, yeah, you may find them irksome, but they are a necessary part of the system, because there are just a profound number of mistakes that are made by the administrative personnel who are regularly doing procurements, and the only way to catch those, the only way to stop, the reason that they've been adopted all over the world, the only way to stop it, only to catch them and stop them, is through an effective bid protest process. On our points, on Judge Braden's points regarding small businesses that would want to use this primarily, yes, it is a much cheaper and more efficient process. I should stress that it's not only folks outside the government that want this to work. What the interviews really showed is that lawyers inside the government want this. That's why Jerry Walsh is in the Commerce Department when he and I worked on this originally back in the 1990s. A government lawyer and a lawyer outside the government were both interested in making this work because it is an efficient alternative.
Yeah,
So-
Professor, let me make a point of clarification. I know that the RAN, I mean, I had it was up to my elbows in that study. Okay. Now, we were lucky, quite candidly, that the lawyers or the groups that they talked to said that that it didn't slow things down. But the full weight of the Defense Department really didn't have a chance to interfere, if you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think your project is a good one. I think to be successful, I would think about carving out DoD, because that's going to be the biggest fight you're going to have. And if it works otherwise, then you may think of certain size level DoD protests that should be subject to it. But I just think you're going to run right into a railroad, and I wouldn't rely necessarily on the RAND report to save you. I mean, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but let me just say it this way: we were very fortunate that they said what they did.
Yeah, I mean, just as a backdrop, and this is a perennial fight between the folks who are doing procurement and protests. The folks who are doing procurement don't like protests. And when I was in the government, I hated protests too. But the legal reality, the backdrop to this is the UN Convention Against Corruption, Article 9. The United States was a primary proponent of that Convention Against Corruption. It says in Article 9 there has to be a bid protest system. Okay, it's a basic anti-corruption device.
But we have it. We have a bid protest system. So that's not the issue. The issue is if you're going to create this agency level thing, where will it be receive the best reception? Who will who will be your supporters?
So if I may, I think this is a point is very well taken, and I appreciate that. It seems to me that there is two questions here, and I don't know the answer to either. The first question is, let's look in a perfect world. If we were designing a system, let's leave aside political, all of that, whatever. If we were deciding a system, would we include the DoD folks in this recommendation? I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need to know the answer to that before we can get to the second question, which is, assuming the answer to that first question is yes, do we nonetheless still think it's prudent to carve out an exception? So I would want to focus on that first question first.
We had this
think
debate,
this is
Aaron.
the right policy. If we think this is the right policy, then I'm inclined to say, well, let's go with it. And if we end up getting it carved out later, let's get it carved out later. But I don't want to necessarily throw in the towel before if it's the right recommendation. Agencies don't have to do what we say at all. It's up to them. We're giving advice. So I don't want to get stuck in the prudential stuff if that's and miss what I think is the core, which is, do we think it would be the better recommendation to include DoD?
Well, I should say that a lot of the most articulate arguers, the people who were most thoughtful about how to improve the agency level bid protest system, were DoD lawyers. The DoD lawyers understand the benefits of an agency level bid protest process. If we carve out DoD, it's probably taking well over half of the procurements off the table. It would really look significant to create that kind of exception. And I should say that, I worked for 10 years on the UNCITRAL, the UN model procurement law. In many countries, the defense departments or the ministries of defense are carved out, and then you become a cesspool of corruption. We were begged by developing countries to include the defense ministries in the UNCITRAL model law precisely for this reason, that they have to be open to accountability, because otherwise you're encouraging. And I don't think the agency level bid protest process is necessarily an additional layer. It's a better approach for the agencies. The agencies want vendors to go to the agency level bid protest process.
Okay, I'm going to turn the time to Matt. You have the floor, Matt.
Just very quickly, it's just a process comment, which is that depending on what the committee decides to do with the Department of Defense, we will obviously want to ensure that we've undertaken, or if we've not already, will undertake some outreach to the Department of Defense.
Matt, it's Susan again. You might, DOJ will probably take the same position as Defense will. Number one, and number two is we had no protests. We talked about this within the RAND group too. I don't think the court has had any protests with the Navy or Marines in a very long time. The problem we had is the Army is where most of the problem was, and the second was in the Air Force. Now the Air Force I think has come a long way since the SpaceX case that I handled, because they changed their procurement, at least in terms of how they're dealing with their launch rockets now, 180%. They've just totally changed it. But the Army really is where most of the protests come out of. So that's something else just to throw in the mix. But not the Navy. The Navy somehow seems to be very savvy about somehow internally solving problems without having an internal protest, but reaching some accommodation. So they've never wound up in our court.
So in interest of advancing today's meeting, I think this is really helpful. I appreciate everybody who has chimed in. This is something that candidly I did not know was a minefield. So what I'm inclined to do is to table this particular discussion. Between this meeting and next, I'll huddle with Matt and his team, and we'll see what's going on with DoD on this. And then we'll have a better sense if we want to carve out or not. I will say that the language, these are all recommendations, so an agency, of course, is not bound by it in any of that. So if DoD decides for whatever reason that this is not a good fit, this is just a recommendation. But I think if we get in this conversation longer without us doing some just outreach, we're going to spin our wheels and not make it through some of the other recommendations. So subject to, people can veto me on this one, I think we should move on to the recommendations, but we're not done with this issue. We're tabling this issue, and we'll circle back on this on the 27th. Gone. Thank you. All right. Let's go back to recommendation one. And I'm not meaning to cut anybody off. I'm really not, but I want to be as most useful as we can with our time. Let's go back to one. There's the question, does this language do the trick of creating the right presumption, or are we missing something here? And Susan had spoken about, tying the scope of agency level protests to the GAO and the Court of Federal Claims. Susan, do you think this language does the trick? Have I lost Susan?
I do.
Okay.
Susan Braden.
Susan Ebner. Too many Susans.
Yes.
You are judge.
I know. Yes.
Going forward, we have Susan Ebner and judge.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have thoughts on recommendation one? Again, we're going to go back to these again at the next meeting, but I don't want to spend a bunch of time on it the second time around. So if folks have additional things they want to add, this is a good time to speak up about recommendation one. We establish a presumption, we let them carve out, and if they are going to carve out, though, they're going to speak the categories of their carve out. Okay, for now, let's move on to recommendation two. And I've been speaking a bit. Mark, will you want to read it for us?
Sure. Agencies should compile in a publicly available document the procedures they apply in adjudicating agency-level protests.
Okay. Does anybody have comments about this one?
Mark, I Mark, I do.
Is that Jim?
Yes, I clicked the check one, but it didn't seem to work. Let me, I hear a playback, but it seems to me that recommendation number 2 is really a key to the entire document, because bias, I think, emerges from the problems are in adjudication. And years ago, when the Information Quality Act passed, we had the same problem. And we initiated a process where we asked the agencies to come up with procedures. And they didn't. So the government had to, which was OMB. So my question is, isn't this leaving the issue a little open without our giving some ideas of the thrust of the actions or procedures that could be used to resolve these conflicts?
Chris?
So the problem, I'm sorry, I've shut off my video. The problem is largely it's a question of transparency and agency-specific procedures. By and large, the agencies are forthright in their supplements for the FAR on the procedures that they use. The goal here is to get them to be completely transparent on the procedures that they use. Again, with a goal of encouraging faith in this process.
That's right. Though, if I understand Jim's point, his point is that procedures is a very broad term, and it might not be clear to agencies what type of procedures we're talking about. Is that a fair summary, Jim?
In our case, we defined the procedures, and we said the first level review went to the people that wrote the document. And on appeal, they went to a different group. And I'm not saying that works for this process, but it was that level of detail.
John Cooney?
I have a very technical comment. It's not on the issues.
It's not on this point. Well, let's hear your technical comment, and then we'll circle back to Jim.
It's a simple and recurrent ACA suggestion that we say that they should make a publicly available document, make certain that that document is recommended to be online.
I agree with that. While a publicly available document, a publicly available online document. Let's put an online in front of document.
Right.
All right, but let's circle back now to Jim's point. Look, my sense, and if folks who've done this a few times with me, is I love the beauty of abstraction. That we can always go deeper into detail, but sometimes if we do that, it just gets bogged down. I don't think, my sense, maybe I'm wrong, again, not the expert here, I think that if we say public available online document, the procedures, I think that will be sufficiently understood, and if it's not, then there's no reason this is the last word on ACUS on the subject. We can circle back. But if we go into greater detail about what exactly we mean and the levels of the various entities and so on, I think that this could be a recommendation of its own rather than a part of a much larger recommendation. That's my instinct. Obviously, I'm happy to be told I'm wrong, or and plus I only have one vote. But that's my sense. Is that your sense too, Chris?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, as the report discussed, there are things that go on behind the scenes. So, for example, the Air Force is compiling information on their agency level protests, and they're using that information to make management decisions. ACUS doesn't want to force the Air Force to make that all transparent, but you do have the limiter here, Aaron, of adjudicating agency level protests. Arguably with the Air Force data compilation is part of agency level bid protests, but it's not, strictly speaking, part of the adjudication process. So you've put a common sense limiter in here, the adjudication, the term adjudicating.
Eloise?
Let's ask about whether, in terms of the procedure, all that we want the agencies to do compile. Does everybody actually have procedures that could be compiled, or does anybody need to have formalized procedures, or do we need to encourage them to do anything like that?
My question, do they have procedures?
Yeah, that is a good threshold question. Thank you, Eloise. Chris, from your interviews, is this something that is it just compiling in one place and making available, or is this creating things that don't yet exist?
In many cases, for the less sophisticated agencies, for the smaller agencies, there wouldn't be published, like, I don't think ACUS has bid protest, agency level bid protest procedures published, but there's probably an internal process for dealing with it, an informal process. This would be encouraging smaller agencies to publish their procedures as much as possible. And
So does HUD have?
What is that, Jim? I couldn't hear you.
Does HUD have these procedures?
Yeah, I think that's what Chris is saying. That's my question too. Is it your sense that even the small agencies, in fact, have procedures?
Yeah, normally they've talked about this issue. How do we deal with an agency level bid protest? Or we handled a bid agency level bid protest last year. How would we handle if one came in this year? That's what the interviews were showing. But we frankly focused on the larger and the military agencies, and they do have well-developed procedures. This is a should rather than a shall. I think it's fine the way it is, Aaron. It's an encouragement, but not a requirement.
Okay, all right, let me record that I'm all for encouragement. And we don't need, I wouldn't push my issue.
I apologize, Jim. I confess I couldn't hear what you were saying. Try one more time.
I guess I need to end I'm satisfied with the outcome.
Okay. Eloise suggests, how about we say agencies should formalize rather than compile, which arguably captures both ideas, or both. Agencies should formalize and compile. So let's put formalize and see how that looks. Formalize, let's say formalize and compile. And does this get anything beyond compile? I confess I'm somewhat indifferent between the two. I see the clarity in what Eloise is saying. It sounds like Chris is saying that's not necessary. Somebody else want to chime in?
I sort of like.
All right, well, how about this? Does anybody object to adding formalize? Hearing none, let's leave it for now. Again, we'll circle back next meeting, but I think that let's have it there for now. Let's move on to number 3. Mark, do you want to read that for us again?
Sure. Agencies should clearly identify who within the agency will adjudicate an agency-level protest. They should strongly consider designating at least one agency protest official, parentheses APO, end paren, a person who specializes in handling agency-level protests, to oversee and coordinate agency-level protests. Agencies lacking the resources to designate their own APO should consider sharing an APO with other agencies.
Okay, the point of this, and as Chris I think explained very well in his opening presentation, is that it's nice to know if you are deciding where you're going to take your bid protest. It's nice to know who the person is that's going to be looking at it, and an agency protest official, someone who does this professionally for a living, who's maybe a little bit separate from the person who made the initial decision, might give you encouragement to use the bid level, the agency level, rather than a higher level process. Is that a fair explanation, Chris?
Yeah, it's really important that there is, in fact, there are two different ways you can approach an agency level protest. One is either go to the contracting officer or go to the higher level official. The real meat of this, Aaron, is in the second sentence. That the higher level official would be an agency protest official, that person would be accountable and would also serve then as a central source of information, management feedback to the agency as to where problems are emerging. The third sentence is a little bit controversial because by definition, if you're using the agency level bid protest process to figure out where the problems are in the agency, to rectify business process problems, sharing an APO between two agencies might not be as effective because then the APO isn't focused on improving, say, the Air Force or the Army. But as a practical matter, agencies may want to have that higher level, as you say, independent official, and may be willing to sacrifice the fact that that APO straddles between two agencies.
Okay. I'm going to throw out a question, and this is to anybody in the room. I don't know how burdensome this will be on agencies, or how much they will see it as an affront to their internal organization, not just their bids, but changing the internal structure of the entity. Chris, maybe this is for you, Chris, but again, for anybody else, in your interviews, was this well received by the agencies as a good idea, or is this something that was thought of as a pretty aggressive proposal?
No, the senior lawyers in the military departments, they liked the idea of an APO because they believed that the APO, you hit on it, Aaron, already. They believed that an APO would allow that lawyer or that official to be more independent, to be able to make decisions that are more independent of the procurement structure. So they liked the idea because they're under constant pressure when they're deciding agency level bid protest. They're under constant pressure to maintain that independence.
Okay. All right. Thoughts from the room?
I think Susan Ebner has her hand up.
Okay. All right. I can't see that. So, all right. Now I see Susan. Thank you, Susan. Take the floor.
So I have a question because within the context of a bid protest are issues relating to procurement integrity, and the contracting officer needs to resolve Procurement Integrity Act concerns when they're raised. So by having an APO, do you think that raises a concern, Chris, that they will need to have it at least initially looked at by the contracting officer? I'm just asking.
No, I think that so Susan's point is a good one, but Susan, the legal link between the Procurement Integrity Act and the implementing regulations of 3.104, it's so tight, and the implementing regulations are so clear that the contracting officer has first responsibility and accountability for procurement integrity violations. I don't see the APO ripping that away. It would be almost impossible. The procurement integrity enforcement structure is very important from a government legitimacy standpoint, and it's in some ways it's counterintuitive because you're asking the agency to resolve its own problem, but the law is very clear on that, and I don't think an APO would interfere with that, Susan. We could make it. We could. Yeah, I think it's clear enough, Susan. I mean, as a practical matter, as a practical matter, GAO kicks out any Procurement Integrity Act violation anyway, kicks it back to the agency. I think an APO would do the same.
So, I mean, here's a question, and this is maybe a question for Reeve or for Matt. All of our recommendations are recommendations. when we have the word should, it also suggests recommendation. Here we have a strongly put in there. Is that par for the course with an ACUS recommendation? Or, I mean, it's a recommendation, but it's a strong recommendation. Does that mean our other recommendations aren't strong? What is that? Does that word give you heartburn?
Reeve?
Yeah, so, I think it's unusual. I can't think of an instance where we've, added the modifier.
Reeve, can you speak up?
Reeve, we can't hear you.
Sure, let me, is this clearer?
A little
Can you
bit.
hear me now? Okay, yeah, let me know if it's not coming through. So yeah, I think adding the adverb strongly would be unusual. I can't think of an instance in which we've done that in the past as sort of an intermediate, perhaps, between should and should consider. I don't want to weigh in one way or the other as to whether or not the committee should do that, but just as sort of a process point, yeah, I think that would be unusual from sort of a past practice perspective. And yeah, I'd struggle a little bit as to sort of what exactly it means here. And, does it intend to imply that the other ones that are just should consider are somehow weaker? I would think probably either should, if you really want the agency to do that, or should consider unadorned would be more typical given past practice.
Yeah,
So-
Aaron, I have sort of an aversion to adverbs in this context generally, but I think the committee should do. I think the committee should do with what it's most comfortable with. My prediction is that on the plenary session floor, that the word strongly would probably get stricken. My prediction, just because it's not really in accord with ACUS practices here, and it would raise the question as to what the other shoulds mean, and whether anything should be read into the absence of the word strongly before the other shoulds.
So my go-to person on all questions of style is Eloise. What do you think? How do you read it, Eloise?
Oh, I'm so flattered, Aaron. I was called a good proofreader by someone today, so to get 2 of these on one day is like thrilling for me. I vote for striking it. It's going to get taken out at some point, and I agree with all the inferences. We should take it out, would be my recommendation.
Okay. Does anybody want to fight for it? I'm inclined to take it out as well, but does anybody want to fight for it? I don't want to be a bully here. All right, hearing none. We'll have a chance to circle back, but hearing none. Any other thoughts about number 3? I think number 3 is tremendously important, and I hope that we can. Again, speaking for myself, I hope that it survives the plenary, because I think this is a very important innovation here. But I also don't want to speak for everybody. But hearing no objections.
Aaron, I'm not objecting, but just so you're aware, this is the most likely objection is one is about resources, imposing additional burdens on the agencies. First of all, the agencies, in all likelihood, there's no way that Congress or the FAR could mandate an APO in every agency, because some agencies are so small it wouldn't make any sense.
Yep.
For those agencies, the larger agencies, such as the Air Force, setting up an APO would mean dual hatting somebody else. Somebody already has a senior position, and they become the APO. And this is a recommendation, as you saw from the report. It's dated back to since before the executive order. So it's really the agencies like the idea, and it isn't necessarily a resource burden because of the dual hatting.
Thank you. I see no hands. Again, it's best if you have a question to send it to me in chat, because I can't see everything at once. But hearing no concerns and seeing no hands in chat, let's move on to number 4. Again, Mark, will you read it for us?
Sure. Agencies should make best efforts to notify protesters of the timeline for agency-level protests.
Okay. And Chris, do you want to give us like the 30-second recap for this one?
Where the idea would be that while there's a best efforts requirement in the FAR rule right now, that the agencies would give more definition to the contractors or to the vendors as to how the process will unfold. Again, borrowing from in loose terms, borrowing from the structure afforded by the Contract Disputes Act. Contract Disputes Act sets clear requirements for the agencies to tell the affected vendors or tell the affected contractors how the process will unfold.
Okay, and now with that, turning to the room, thoughts? I guess maybe I'll get started with a question, and that is, will folks reading this understand what we mean by this? Chris gave an explanation where he referenced something else. Do we need to have a reference to something else, or is this sufficiently clear to, a relevant contracting agency that they'll pick this up and they'll say, "Oh, I get what ACUS is saying"?
It's discussed in some detail in my report.
It is in the report. I'm trying to remember if it's in the preamble. Do we explain what we mean by that in the preamble? Mark, do you remember?
I don't recall off the top of my head, no.
Well, Mark, Susan, I see Susan Ebner has a comment. Susan.
I know you're probably not going to invite me back after this, Chuck, but
we certainly will.
But I think that that's a good recommendation from my perspective as someone who litigates. If you knew what the timeline was, you might then, withdraw your protest and file at the GAO if they were going to take too long. This would incentivize the agency to try and address this as soon as possible and not delay it. I mean, I think that having a timeline forces people to really think about the consequences of if they don't address this quickly. Would they go to the Court of Federal Claims? Would they seek an injunction? So I think it's a good argument to incentivize using agency protests.
Sure, I agree with that. My question is a little bit different, but I think you are the right person to answer it. And that is, will people know what we mean by a timeline? A timeline can mean all sorts of things. A timeline can mean we will let you know, within a year whether or not this will be done, and that's it. I've given you a timeline. It starts and it ends, and at some point it'll be there. But that's a timeline of such a level of abstraction that it doesn't help you. I think we're asking for something a little bit more specific. I think that agencies will know what we mean, especially if we discuss this in the preamble. But as someone who lives in this space, if you saw this sentence and you picked it up, would you know what we mean?
I would.
Okay.
I would. I mean, you can tinker with it, but I mean, even if it's just a timeline of we'll dispose of this in a year, that's going to give people a really good indicator of whether or not they want to stick with the agency protest or go somewhere else. I think.
Perfect. Thank you. Eloise?
I just wanted to make sure that we really want to address comments 4 and 5 in this order. And maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but
Let's look at them together.
Okay.
Explain.
Well, so I am not at all in the weeds of this area, but to me, 4 is about let's tell the people what we mean by time, and 5 is let's maybe adopt some better time practices. But maybe 5 is getting at something different more specifically in a way that I don't understand because I'm not in this field.
Or maybe a friendly amendment. Could we combine 4 and 5? Are they saying very similar things? Agencies should consider adopting presumptive process deadlines and informing the public of them, something like that.
Right. To me, as an outsider, they seem like they're related, but they seem like we're going tiny to big, which feels awkward. So I would adopt, if they really are the same thing, what Aaron just said makes sense to me.
Chris?
That makes a lot of sense.
Are these the same? Are these the same? Could these be the same thing?
Yeah, you
And
could
then-
do it.
And then I'll turn it to Susan.
Yeah, for example, you could, if you combine 4 and 5 and then started 5, what is now 5, for example, agency should consider adopting. I think it all works very well.
So keep what we have 4, add a for example in front of 5, and combine them into 1.
Yeah.
Susan Ebner.
I guess I don't agree with that. I think maybe 5 should come before 4, because the issue of here are my presumptive process deadlines for how long it's going to take, each step of the way, what is the process, when are, responses due, et cetera. But I think having a notice for a particular procurement, how long that protest is going to take is going to be very important to a protester. So a slightly different point. One is just, here's what the process is. You can expect a decision by X date. You can expect within 30 days, you'll have to get the agency report. Within 45, you'll have a response. Within 50, you'll have a decision. But if I have a protest and I'm filing it, and it's going to be longer, a presumptive, here's my process, isn't going to answer that question.
So what about this? Just throwing out an idea. Maybe I'm crazy here, Chris or Susan, tell me. What if we went with 5 instead of 4 as the language, and then we said after what's now 5, we took 4 and say agency should also make, but combine them all into one thought.
Yeah. Susan and I are coming out of a world where built into the regulations that surround the Contract Disputes Act is model language that issues to individual contractors saying this is what's going to happen, this is the timeline. So yeah, that would work perfectly. Susan is saying we need to have a general admonition that there should be clear deadlines, and individual vendors have to know what those are.
Susan, does that work for you? If we put
Yes.
it, agencies should also.
What we're getting at here is that, Aaron, is that oftentimes a small business is typically, it's one man or one woman running a small business. And while it may be buried in regulations, it's really good that the regulations require that they get a letter saying exactly what's going to happen.
I guess I would add one, to me, if they would make best efforts to notify protesters of the specific timeline for the agency protest. So maybe amend it to notify protesters of the timeline for each specific agency protest. That may be onerous for the agency, but I think it would really help protesters.
I think
Mark, can you put that in? But I'm going to write what Susan just said, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eloise, and we'll circle back if we want to keep that language.
Sure. Susan, would it suit your purposes if you added the word specific after 4 in the last sentence of the current recommendation for specific agency level protests? Or for
Just
When
like
they're
that so you can
specific.
see it.
If you put their specific, so
their specific?
yeah.
Okay,
and Eloise.
So this conversation has been really helpful, and it made me realize I didn't actually understand what the recommendation was. So there's a difference between sort of like the general procedures, the general timelines we're talking about, and then a protest by protest variation. That I am actually finding a little confusing. So now I think I understand it less than I did a minute ago.
No, what we're saying is that there will be general procedures, and how they affect individual vendors is telegraphed to the vendors through a letter. Say, we received your protest on this date. It will be resolved by this date. That's what happens.
Okay.
But I would add, just if I might, that at the Court of Federal Claims, you don't have a deadline of here's how long it will take you to adjudicate. And larger protests take longer sometimes, or more complex ones may take longer. At the GAO, you only have 100 days. That's the outside cap. And so when there's a cap, it's not going to take a year. It's going to take at most 100 days. And under their process, the first 30 days, the agency puts together the agency report, then you have 10 days to respond to it. So you see that you have an idea of what's happening at each stage.
And Eloise, you heard that Judge Braden mentioned already the fact that the protests are much more expensive at the Court of Federal Claims. That's partly because the timelines are much less well defined. It just sprawls and gets much more expensive.
Okay, so we've heard a lot of answers to Eloise's question. Is your question answered? I think I'm where Eloise is on this. I'm coming at this as an outsider, and I'm doing my best to understand. What do you think?
I don't think that last sentence fully captures what I think you've explained, because what I think you've explained, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying, okay, the deadlines in general, the rules say 10 days for this, 100 days for that. And then I think now you want the second sentence. What you want to have happen is that each vendor will get a letter that says March 17th, June 30th. Is that right? So I don't know that the timeline for their specific agency level protest, I don't think that fully captures it enough. So let me figure out a suggestion of how agencies should also make best efforts to notify protesters of how those general timelines apply to.
Genius.
Okay.
Isn't she great?
I survived a 10-year drafting process at the United Nations. People like Eloise were a godsend.
Thank you all. ACUS is my people. I'm so happy to be here.
I like that language. That language makes sense to me. But again, I speak of somebody who this is all I'm learning as we go along here. So if it makes sense to me, it could be I'm just misunderstanding. To Chris or to Susan, who live in this space, does this make sense?
Yeah.
Let's go with Susan first. Does this make sense, Susan?
Sorry, I couldn't get unmuted. I think it's fine.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, and what's buried in the first sentence, and this is referred to in the report, I'm saying yes, and what's buried in the first sentence is actually more, which is that there are process deadlines, there are intermediate process deadlines that more sophisticated agencies such as GSA have adopted, but that's buried already in the first sentence.
Okay, I like this. I'm asking the room thoughts. Is there anybody are we missing something? Concerns? It just doesn't read right to you. If not, no, I'm going, gone. Let's go to number 6. Again, Mark, if you can do the honors.
Agencies consider adopting the same rules for compiling and sharing the record as applied to GAO level protests.
Okay, my reaction, and I think my reaction is going to be the same as a lot of people at ACUS, is that sounds great to me. I have no idea what that really means in the real world. So is this something, Chris, that is a heavy ask of agencies, or is this something that is a fairly modest ask?
Yeah, as Mark and I discussed, this is probably because my report is so cautious, this is probably the most, I think the most controversial aside from the scope of jurisdiction, the subject matter jurisdiction. This, if read on its face, it would mean that in an agency level bid protest, which is fast and sometimes somewhat sloppy, the agencies would have to compile a very extensive record if it's read strictly. However, in a GAO level protest, an agency council know this, they really only compile the documents that they consider relevant. And so that relevance, that delimiter of relevance, would allow them to compile a much more limited administrative record in an agency level protest as well. They could say only these few documents are relevant. It would be very difficult to second guess them. So strictly read, this could be very burdensome. But in reality, Aaron, I think that agency council would take a much narrower approach and say only these few documents are relevant.
Susan.
So it's not that I totally disagree with what Chris says, but my concern is if you change the agency process so that you're going to have to require protective orders, it's going to get much more burdensome for a protest. Because an agency protest with a protective order is going to say, you small business can't represent yourself at a protest because now you need outside counsel who's not a competitive decision maker to go and review these documents. I mean, it may be in the end that we can limit the documents to only those that are the protesters, and so maybe we don't need it. And so instead of saying the same rules, I would say similar rules, you know, but I really am concerned about making this too heavy a lift for a protester.
You know, and I'm glad that Susan raises. So first of all, I completely agree with her about similar being fine. And then with regards to and sharing, and I'm glad she highlighted, Susan, I really try to break up the questions in my report into two. One is the record that's compiled internally in the agency, and the second is the question of what's shared. Agency counsel came back at me very hard on the question of sharing without a protective order, but the impossibility of putting a protective order in place. So I think 6 should be limited to the question of the compiled record, and that similar rules for compiling and take out and sharing, because sharing can be dealt with under 7. Sharing is very controversial.
Okay, I can live with that.
I confess I have no instincts here. This is beyond my knowledge. Is there somebody else in the room who maybe has instincts here? Though I don't want to second guess. We've got Chris and Susan. That's a world of experience. But I want to make sure that we're thinking this through all the way. So is there somebody else? I'm just going to throw it out here. This is unfair, but John, what are your thoughts?
The one thing I know about this area is that this is the one that discourages all the litigators I worked with from coming to the agency, because if you don't have some sense of what's in the record, you're basically, it's like trying a case without discovery. You just have to reassert everything that you just asserted, and that's all you have to go with. But the question of sharing inevitably gets into two questions. One is, what is going to be the burden in assembling all this material, and how long is that going to take? Does that affect the timelines? But the second, and probably the more important part to the litigators I know, is the confidentiality agreement that would have to be reached. That means the world to people who are competing against each other in a government contract setting. So that's very vague, but that's all the responses I have.
Oh, I think that's really helpful. Okay, so let's break it down into 2 parts. I think Chris is right about that. So let's look at 6. I think 6 should just be compiling, and I like similar. A question I have here is, do we do a classic ACUS hedge and put a to extent feasible in here, or is this already feasible? We're not asking anything too hard. So for background, for folks who haven't been through this process before, I've noticed that whenever we ask agencies to do things that are potentially burdensome, even though all of these are recommendations by definition, we often will throw in to an extent feasible, letting them know that we're cognizant of their resource limitations. Is this one of those types of issues, or is this something that this isn't a heavy lift if it's just compiling?
So Aaron, this is really the real check here is actually not the agency bid protest process itself, but rather the embarrassment that the agency decision maker would suffer is if the contracting people didn't put in front of him or her a complete record, and it later emerges during a GAO or a court protest that they didn't have a complete record. So if you put to an extent feasible in, that's absolutely fine, because that agency decision maker still can turn to the contracting person or to the agency counsel and say, hey, what the heck happened? you didn't give me a complete record, and yet the rule, presuming this is a FAR rule, the revised rule says, to the extent feasible, you should have given me a complete record. I didn't have a complete record, and I made the wrong decision as a result.
Louise.
This is on a slightly different point, so.
Okay.
I
mean, I guess I'm turning into a wimp. My instinct is that this will more likely to be accepted if we have it to extent feasible in there. And it's a code. Like I said, all of these are recommendations, but it's almost like a chin up. We're in there with you. We understand that you have limited resources. So I'm inclined to put a to extent feasible in there because it illustrates that we're not trying to do unfunded mandates on agencies. Does anybody oppose that? Okay, no one seems to. Mark, can you put agencies to the extent feasible should consider? Oh, I'm such a wimp now. I'm looking at myself. Well, what have I become? All right, Eloise, take the floor.
This is a really small point, but I noticed a couple of other places where we refer to some outside document. So in the Contracts Disputes Act, at what's now line 91, and then a little bit later we talk about GAO rules. We have a statute, we have a citation, and I personally don't know where to find the rules that apply to GAO level protests. I don't know whether you want to say in the, just sort of say what document these rules are in, or if that's too specific.
No, I think it's very useful. It's a sister to the FAR 33.103 is agents level protest. I think GAO is 33.104. It's literally right next to it on the FAR.
So then my instinct is including the citation. We have to figure out what it is. That was a very impressive recitation of what it might be.
It's 4 CFR Part 121, isn't it?
Let's just put a placeholder in. I mean, put it in now, but we will obviously confirm.
Yeah, and
maybe
and in 6 also, right? Like
and in 6 also.
I'm wrong.
Hold on for 1 second. Sorry, it's
Exactly 104.
It is 104, Susan.
Yeah, well, no, hold on. I can't get on my computer and be on this thing at the same time. It's not working.
so if I just
Yeah, we'll say add site and put add site up in 6 too. I think it'll be at the end of the sentence. Yeah. I think that makes perfect sense. I like that. Okay, let's look at 6. This is our last chance with 6. We have it an extent feasible. We have a similar. I think at this point we have certainly been accommodating to the agencies. I feel okay with this one, but again, feel free to speak up if we're missing anything. I'll count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, we're there for now. Let's go to 7. 7 is long and also quite important. Again, I'm going to impose. Mark, can you please read it for us?
Agencies that do not adopt GAO's rules for compiling and sharing the record should still make available in a timely manner as much of the procurement record as is feasible. If important parts of the record are confidential, agencies should consider disclosing them to protesters subject to a protective order. When disclosure subject to a protective order is infeasible, agencies should inform protesters about important but confidential parts of the agency record through alternative means. Those alternative means could include enhanced debriefings and confidentiality agreements between protesters and agencies.
Okay, so Chris, that's a mouthful. Can you give us the 45-second version so we know what we're talking about and why?
Yeah, John's really right that this is really the cornerstone to reform, making more of the record available. And again, for the reasons I discussed earlier, we're at a historical point where 20 years from now, this will be a non-issue because all this information will be coded and will be easy to disclose very quickly. Right now, it's a major burden for agencies to redact records. They don't have to do so. Susan, I think it's $100 million is the line. Procurements above $100 million, they need to produce a redacted version of the source selection document, but for smaller procurements, they don't, presumptively. So bottom line is, this paragraph tries to wind its way between very angry agency lawyers who do not want to have to spend hours and hours and hours redacting agency documents all the time, and on the other hand, the need for maximizing transparency to make this a legitimate process.
Okay, Robert. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I actually have a question about protective orders in the context of an agency level bid protest. If there's no independent administrative tribunal or court involved, how could there even be a protective order?
The answer is it's almost impossible to do, which is why then you revert to the alternatives that are laid out in the rest of the paragraph.
Susan, and I'll go back to Robert, but Susan.
So 2 points. One, not a protective order. I think I wouldn't want one at an agency level protest, but a non-disclosure agreement potentially might be appropriate. The other, I guess my feeling is enhanced debriefings have proven their value at any size and for any kind of protester. You have an entity that's concerned about a procurement, making an enhanced debriefing available, even if they haven't protested, is a benefit to avoid protests. So I would, if there's a possible way of exhorting the agency to include extended debriefings or enhanced debriefings, to entities that request them without even requiring a protest, I would do that.
So Robert, you've heard 2 answers to, I think, was an excellent question. What is your thought of what we should do with it?
I have to admit I don't know all that much about this area, and I especially appreciate Susan's point that a very informative debriefing may be the best thing possible. But if we're going to be recommending that agencies should be considering disclosing confidential portions of the procurement record subject to a protective order if feasible, I think we need to be able to articulate what we mean by that. Because, I'm thinking that if there's source selection sensitive material or proprietary data, including proprietary data of a competitor that's protected under the Trade Secrets Act, I just can't quite wrap my mind around how an agency will sort of internally create its own protective order that the parties will stipulate to agree to.
So one elegant way to address these concerns might be to say in this second sentence, if important parts of the record are confidential, agencies should consider disclosing them to protesters subject to applicable legal requirements. That would sweep up the trade agreements, the Trade Secrets Act issues that Robert raised, and then take out the word protective order, and then the protective order only pops up in the next sentence.
I think Jim has a thought. Jim? Is Jim on mute? He sent me a message saying he wanted to be on. I can't see him. All right. Okay. Well, let's go back and say, so I certainly agree that the agency should follow applicable legal requirements. We've often said that every recommendation has an implicit asterisk subject to the law. But I think here it's useful to say that this isn't just a general one, this is a specific one. So I'm inclined, I don't have a problem with applicable legal requirements here. But I guess, I don't know, I struggle with this because I don't know this is not my field. How much is left after the applicable legal requirements have already done their work? Are we talking about a world where half the time they'll be able to do what we're talking about? Or are we talking about a world where only this portion of the recommendation only applies like 5% of the time, and almost always we're going to be in the disclosure subject to a protective order is infeasible half of the recommendation? And if that's the case, it makes me wonder if we need the first half of this. So that's just an empirical question that maybe Susan or Chris can answer. How often will agencies be able to turn over confidential parts of the record subject to applicable legal requirements? Or do applicable legal requirements essentially mean you can't turn over confidential information?
So just empirically, to answer your question, Aaron, from the private side, typically a law firm will budget 10% of the bid protest cost as the cost of redaction, but empirically, the actual information that's redacted is probably somewhere around 1% of the information that's available in the protest. Susan may have a different view on that, on the second number.
I would say it depends on whether or not it's a protest where you're challenging an opponent, competitor's selection or whatever. In that case, it's going to be a really hard battle in terms of redacting documentation and providing it to a protester. Where it's the protester's own procurement non-selection, where they're contending they weren't evaluated properly, the normal enhanced briefings that are available, as Chris mentioned, for the higher level dollar procurements do allow for that kind of sharing, because then you're just sharing where the competitor protester, where that protester kind of fell down, didn't answer the mail. But whenever you're talking about the competitor's submission, you're going to be much more concerned about revealing any of that information, because it could potentially give a competitive edge in a reprocurement or some sort of corrective action later.
Eloise and then Jim.
So a few minutes ago, I think I heard Susan use the words non-disclosure agreement. And so I was wondering whether, and I confess I'm getting a little lost in the applicable legal requirements as being maybe way too vague. So I was wondering if something like this would capture what you are talking about. In this sentence, agencies should consider disclosing them to protesters under a non-disclosure agreement that redacts or with redactions. I think what you're talking about, when you're talking about applicable legal requirements, you're talking about redactions in some way. So if there's anything else, then maybe we don't want to be so specific as redactions. But I think you're talking about redactions, and so maybe that word should be in there. And then I didn't understand why, if we're not talking about a protective order in this sentence, we would talk about a protective order in the second sentence, or in the sentence that follows, which is why I thought maybe going back to the non-disclosure agreement made some sense.
All right, so I have a pretty radical thought, but I'm going to let Jim have the floor first.
Okay, you can hear me?
We can hear you, Jim.
The agencies that do not adopt the GAA rules, how many didn't adopt?
I heard everything to the very end. What was the end of that sentence?
How many agencies didn't adopt the GAO rules?
So Chris, how many don't adopt GAO rules?
In terms of the record, none of the agencies provide a GAO, have a GAO type situation where the administrative record would presumptively be available to protesters' counsel. None of them have that. The Air Force has inched towards that with the use of non-disclosure agreements.
And what was their reaction, the reason for not doing that?
They were extremely, the agency council were extremely angry at the prospect of having to redact an entire record in all procurements because of what is interesting actually, it's not only the burden of having to redact everything, but having to argue through internally the redactions. They take it so seriously that they typically have more than one person working on the redaction and they argue about it. And that creates a lot of transaction costs for the agencies. So this is, the paragraph 7 is an attempt to accommodate that frustration on the part of the agencies and yet point to the day in the future, 20 years from now, when everything will regularly be produced.
So I guess we're assuming if they don't listen to GAO, they'll listen to ACUS.
This is kind of like the desegregation decisions in the 1950s. We're encouraging all deliberate speed towards a much more transparent future.
Well, this most certainly is deliberate speed, and I think both things should be looked at, how deliberate it is and speed.
So here's my radical thought, and maybe everyone's going to say that I'm wrong, but it seems to me as I read 7 again that it's getting pretty specific and maybe too specific when we're trying to illustrate a principle rather than tell them exactly how to go about navigating confidentiality, etc. So what we could do would be to raise, again, the level of abstraction and just go with a version of the first sentence. And it would be something like this. Agencies should make available in a timely manner as much of the procurement record as is feasible, period. We don't get into whether or not they adopt GAA rules, and we don't get into how you do confidentiality and enhanced debriefings, whatever, all of which are covered in the report. We just go with nice, simple statement of principle that agencies should make the record available if feasible, and be done with it and leave it to them to figure out what that means. And maybe down the road, if this is not working, ACUS can return to this and figure out what that would look like. But maybe we don't need to get into the details about enhanced debriefings and confidentiality, and if not X, then Y, and so on. We can just leave the principle in place. Now, maybe I'm crazy. That's my radical idea. I see Susan has a comment, and I see Robert has a comment. Susan.
So radical idea, I don't know, but my thought is, what if we left your sentence, took out the rest of the paragraph, but left the last sentence so that alternative means could include enhanced debriefings or confidentiality agreements, so that covers the waterfront of you want confidentiality agreements if that's appropriate to disclose whatever you need to disclose, or you enhance debriefings, and we don't get into whether you need a protective order or some other vehicle.
So maybe I'm not crazy. Great. Thank you. I like to hear that. Robert.
Yeah, I was actually thinking along the same lines. I think that if you cut out the middle of it, the information about protective orders that people are not really going to understand, stick with the first sentence as you suggested, and then keep the ending sentence with revisions. Maybe something like agencies should consider use of enhanced debriefings and confidentiality agreements between protesters and agencies to address confidential information in the record. I think it would work.
I like that. Let's see what that looks like. Mark has the hardest job here. Let's watch Mark type in real time.
The spotlight's on me, and I got to say I'm wilting. I'm trying to figure all this out. Agencies should consider the use of enhanced debriefings and confidentiality agreements. Robert, could you repeat, please, the last part of your suggested amendation?
Yeah, after the sentence that ends between protesters and agencies, just add to address confidential information in the record.
Great. And then, Aaron, if you don't mind, what parts of just so we're all on the same page, which parts of this?
Yeah, so delete the first sentence, delete that, and then delete everything that before Robert's edit.
All right.
What do we think?
This without a red line.
I mean, my view is that if Robert says it, it's probably right. But and especially when Robert agrees with me, then he's always right. But we might very well be wrong. I guess, Chris, what do you think? Is this going to be helpful to? I mean, you spoke with the agencies. Would this be helpful, or do they need some of the specificity that we're proposing to cut?
I think this is as far as we can go, Aaron. So I think it's a nice solution for this.
Okay. Does anybody want to push back? If not, I'm going to say let's do it. It's the beauty of cutting. Less is more. Okay. All right. So I'm going to pause for a second here. We're at 45 minutes to go. We've been going for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Do folks need a 5-minute break? Would that be helpful? Or do you just want to power through and get as much done as we can? I'm fine doing it either way. If people want to take a 5-minute break, we can take a 5-minute break, or we can just power through. Would anybody like a break? Okay, hearing none. No, Eloise says, I like breaks. All right, we're gonna take 5 minutes.
But don't let me drive everything if nobody else,
No, it's the rule of like kindergarten, that if someone has the question, other people have the question too. So we should be grateful for the brave person who raises their hand. So that's what we'll do. We'll take 5 minutes. We'll be back at 2:20 for the remainder 40-minute stretch. So everybody get up, take a stretch, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.
You can, but I don't know that that kind is going to taste that good raw.
All right. All right, we'll give people a minute to get back, and then we'll get in for a 40-minute stretch run. How are you doing, Mark?
Hanging in there. I got to say, as far as this is my maiden voyage doing one of these things, so it's a trip.
You have the hardest job. It's the hardest job. I feel bad. I mean, the harder job is when you do it in the plenary and there's 200 people looking at you as you show off your typing skills. You're doing an excellent job.
I look forward to those nightmares as the plenary approaches. I'm down. That's going to be great.
All right. So maybe it's just my computer. I can't see almost anybody because I see the screen. Is there a way that I can see the audience and see the screen at the same time, or just not? I don't know who's here is why I'm asking. Are most of the people back?
Well, they don't have their cameras on, so it's very hard to see.
Yep.
But there is a way. I mean, this is my first trip through this, but you can go up to, there's a bar at the top.
Yep.
And you should be able to pull down and have the photos along the top of the document.
Okay.
Aaron, you want to click view everyone? There's only a few of us who have our cameras on.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can. Active cameras. Let's do that. Okay, great. Thank you. So Anne, we're waiting for you to chime in here.
Well, I chimed in early. I had 3 points on the first recommendation, so now I'm deferring to Eloise's amazing wording and proofing skills.
All right. Well, the time has come, so we've had our 5-minute break. We've got 40 minutes to go. Let's see what we can get done. We're not going to get all done, and that's fine. We've got built in another session, but I would like to at least get as much done as we can. So when we come back on the 27th, it's not with new ground, it's ground we've already seen before. So at least we'll have a sense where people are. I think that's better. So let's see how much we can get done. Hopefully we can at least look at most everything, and then we'll circle back on the 27th. So with that, Mark, will you please do the honors and read for us 8 for the people on the phone?
Sure thing. Agencies should provide prompt written notice to protesters of procedural milestones in agency-level protests, including when agency level proceedings are initiated and terminated.
Okay, Chris, as an outsider to this, I read this and this seems very commonsensical. It doesn't seem unduly burdensome. Am I crazy? Where does this rank in terms of the burden we're putting on agencies?
No, it really does. So, Aaron, my comment actually is a drafting comment that these paragraphs would be combined with the earlier paragraphs that have to do with the Contract Disputes Act.
Okay, that's always good. I always like cutting. So
cutting and pasting.
Right. So let's move it up. Let's see what that would look like. Would this be a separate to 4, addition to 4? How would that look?
It would be after the current 5.
Okay, after the current 5. So let's just move in there and see what it looks like. Let's make it a separate recommendation, though, because that's a mouthful. Okay. All right. So I'm hearing some feedback from somebody. Do we know who that is? It sounds like a robot. Okay, I don't hear it now. All right. So we've moved it. I like the move. Content-wise, at least the first part doesn't seem problematic to me about providing prompt notice of milestones. It seems like that should be built into the process deadlines we're talking about. But before we get to the second part, am I wrong about that? Am I missing something? What do we think? And then if not, we'll get to the second part, which I think is maybe a little bit trickier. Comments? I'm gonna ask Susan. Susan, do you concur with Chris that the first half of the sentence, the first half of the recommendation about milestones is not, we're not asking a lot there?
I agree. I think that's fine.
Okay. Does anybody disagree? And bear in mind, between this meeting and next, we will talk to some agency folks. We'll see if there's any pushback. But that seems fine to me. But what is going on here, Mark?
The formatting is killing me.
Okay.
As soon as you pointed it out, trying to figure out how to make this a new recommendation.
Okay.
Sorry.
Let's give you a second. That's fine. We'll give you a second so we can at least put an enter between compiling the record, so it's not big one long on run-on sentence or paragraph.
Yeah.
So can you put an enter after compiling the record so we can
hold on.
look at it?
Right. There we go.
Okay.
I'll fix the formatting after this.
We'll fix the formatting. Let's focus on the second half of the sentence. And can you highlight the second half of the sentence so we can at least all look at the same thing? Perfect. Now, I like this. This is speaking from my own policy perspective. I think this makes all the sense in the world. I feel bad for people who get stuck in traps where we don't know it's adverse or not, and you're just playing along with the game, and then it turns out that they say that you made some inadvertent foot fault and you're out. But I also wonder about what is that? What does this really mean? This feels kind of legal in character. Does the agency have to say what counts as adverse action? And does that have relevance to a court? If an agency says this isn't adverse, can a court still say that it is? This seems like a kind of a tricky admin law question that I bet Ann Joseph O'Connell has useful thoughts about.
Well, good, Aaron. Your instincts are exactly right. The GAO will count as the time for protesting a GAO any adverse agency action, whether or not it's express or implied. And so the goal here, and that's a huge sand trap, because to make it clear for the vendor that they have suffered adverse action, and that would start triggering GAO deadlines.
But is that an agency? This is a legal question. Is that an agency call? Can an agency say this isn't an adverse action and have it not be an adverse action, or is that something that a court determines, regardless of what the agency has to say about it? So I understand the policy and what we're driving for, and I agree with it. I guess I just don't know, as a legal matter, if that is correct. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm missing it.
Anne looked concerned, so I want to defer to her.
Anne says she has a thought. Anne, will you take the floor?
I've looked at very few decisions and the annual reports by the GAO, but I don't think that's the agency's call to make. So I guess I have two concerns. One is the concern that I think the GAO determines whether something's kind of meets its jurisdiction or not. And then two, I'm not sure the burden in our role as ACUS should be placed on the agency as opposed to the interested party. Now, of course, from what I understand from the report, like you want as much information, especially given that the agencies are not producing records. You want as much transparency as possible so the affected party knows that they've been affected adversely, but I'm not sure this is the way to get at it. But that's just my take, and again, this is not my area.
Susan.
I would agree with Anne that I think this sentence is problematic. As Chris mentioned, you know, GAO will decide if an adverse action has occurred. The key here is that if a protester doesn't timely go to GAO after the agency has issued a decision or taken an action, that it could be viewed as untimely and deprived of an opportunity to go to the GAO for a protest action. So, I mean, I definitely would take out the last half of that sentence to set a specific number of days, because I don't know that that really is going to solve the question. And I also wonder if calling it an adverse action maybe just means a decision. If they have issued a decision, they'll make it clear that they've issued a decision. So you're not wondering, did they make a decision and I just didn't see it?
So there's just so Anna, there's GAO precedent that says if the agency goes forward and makes an award despite a protest, that's adverse agency action. That the protester should infer that the agency has rejected the protest creates huge risk for the protester.
Agreed.
Yeah, so I'm very, very sympathetic to what we're trying to accomplish here, because I agree. I think I'm going to speak now as an appellate lawyer. This comes up in litigation a fair bit, where is this an appealable order or not, and then people don't know, and it creates all sorts of confusion, and it's just not. That's not a way to run a railroad. But I don't know if this language does it, because what do we mean to say agencies should clearly identify what constitutes adverse action? I mean, maybe Susan's point about agencies should clearly identify when they have made a decision is closer to what we're saying, and that essentially overlaps with what's going to be adverse action. But it seems kind of strange to put the burden on them to make a legal call that's ultimately going to be made by somebody else.
No, but the reason to do that, Aaron, is because GAO's rules are so poorly drafted, or GAO will allow there to be an inferred adverse action. It's really a problem with GAO, but getting the GAO to change its rules so that it demands an explicit action on the part of the agency in order to trigger GAO deadlines, that's a very steep hill to climb. So instead, we're taking a second best solution, which is to put the burden on the agency to be explicit about what the status of the protest is.
Eloise?
I was just going to suggest that aren't we just talking about communicating the decision? Does that capture the implicit problem that GAO is?
Yeah.
Claiming we just sort of require to communicate a decision.
Yeah. Let's put that language up for now. We might go back to it, but let's just play with that. If Mark, if you could put that there, and then we'll figure that out. Well, it's going to be tricky to do, but thank you for trying. I mean, I'm sympathetic to what Chris is saying because I want to fix the problem, but I don't know if there's a good way to fix it. I see Susan has a comment, and then Anna has a comment, and then John has a comment. So Susan.
Okay, so, and this is based on my experience with agency protests. A common parlor trick is that the agency issues an award on a specific day, like a Thursday, but then doesn't submit the letter notifying the protester or the other parties until the Friday afternoon at 5, which gives a very, very small window for a protester to go protest, because they have to do it within 10 days to get a mandatory stay at the GAO, for example. So if they play games and they issue a decision, but they don't notify you until the next day and it's a weekend, you've now lost this time. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I sort of would like to avoid that kind of trickery when it comes to an agency protest.
Anne.
So I agree with that. So I just wanted to, just so we weren't talking past each other, back to Chris, is I think definitely the change of language to the decision and taking out the legal determination of, avoids my concern. I don't want the agency, because the adverse stuff suggests that the agency is making the legal determination, but it's not. I mean, the GAO rules, yes, have built in certain inferences, but it's not the agency's call.
John, is your comment beyond just the jurisdictional questions are very dangerous?
It's on the jurisdictional question. This is a litigator's nightmare. There's an agency GAO with a floating definition of what constitutes action. And you're sitting there understanding that if you miss it, you face the loss of a client and the possibility of a malpractice action. So if the trigger is not certain, it's another reason why somebody would want to steer away from an agency level protest. And so we need to take that, the nightmare in the litigator's mind, into account in trying to draft language that would cover this point. It appears to be due to the GAO's declining to tie its own hands and come up with a useful definition that people can count on.
Okay. So
to John's point, Aaron, is to equate adverse action and a decision. That's the key thing, to equate adverse action and a decision, because that way there's certainty for the vendor.
So what do you think of the language Eloise proposed about using a decision rather than, so the word would be decision rather than the word adverse action? Does that do the trick for you, Chris? Is that going to solve the problem, or at least 80% of the way solve the problem with GAO, or what? Because I confess I struggle with essentially saying the agency should clearly say when they've made an adverse action, because then it means the agency has to decide what's an adverse action, and that's a disputed legal call. But whereas you can say it seems less disputed to say the agency has made a decision, less disputable rather. But maybe
I'm being quiet. I'm being quiet, Aaron, not because I disagree with you in any way. I'm just trying to think through all the scenarios.
Sure.
And the decisions, decision might be something as amorphous as correcting a specification, and as long as there's a clear notice to the vendor at that point that they have made a decision, that they have corrected the specification, I think that's going to solve John's problems, what he calls a litigator's nightmare.
So Eloise, you're proposing some language, and Anna's proposing some language. Let's keep our words in vocal form. Can you explain?
Okay, sorry. I thought it might be more helpful to have the words on the chat, but I will switch back to vocal. I just think
we have people on the phone too as part of the problem.
Oh. Now, okay. That's helpful. Communicating to you when they want to get in the queue. Agencies, I was just thinking that instead of agencies should clearly identify in line 96, we want it to be communicate, because the whole point is that we're trying to give notice. It's not, we don't care what the agencies think. We want the recipients to actually receive something. So there's that. Anyway, then two other totally minor points / questions. I don't love our opening phrase to eliminate uncertainty as to whether an agency has decided to protest, and I would just recommend striking it. We don't explain all the reasons why we do everything else. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think we need the words, so I would just delete them. And then that last bit, again, I thought I heard Susan a little while ago talk about say something substantively negative about the deemed denied. And I just wanted to make sure that we didn't gloss over it, because that's still a substantive point that I'm not totally sure I understand what the actual experts think.
Let's save that last thought. Let's one at a time here. And if we got rid of that part, does that solve your question?
No, I would just add, so switch to communicate, but then as I understand this kind of Friday night dump, to say quickly or immediately, right? If every day matters, then it's not just that you have clear communication, but that you have immediate communication.
Clearly, I would go with promptly. Clearly and promptly communicate. Okay, so before we get to the deemed stuff, is there consensus? Again, I wish I was in the room. I could look around and get a feel if anybody is feeling angst about this. Is anybody feeling angst about agencies should clearly and promptly communicate when they have made a decision about that? Or are people okay with this? Susan.
I have angst about promptly because
Okay.
I don't know what promptly means. And to me, they should communicate it the day they make a decision, if they make it, so that there's no delay.
Okay, let's go with immediately. You're an Anne Joseph O'Connell person. I like it. Let's do it. I mean, and then they'll say immediately. What does that mean? But
a lot more than promptly, yes.
Yep. It means more than promptly.
Just to go back to another project that you oversaw, Aaron, in the Vacancies Act, it says to notify immediately, and many cabinet departments take 300 days.
Well, all right. We can't solve all the problems in the world. I like immediately. We're going to go with immediately for now. We'll circle back on this next time. Let's talk about the deemed, and maybe that's going to be almost the end of what we get to. So the deemed, can you explain why the purpose of the deemed? I like deemed. Can you explain why we have it here, Chris?
So it's the black hole problem. Right now, it's the agencies are to make their best efforts to resolve the protest within 35 days. But sometimes they just sit there and you never hear. We have two choices. One is to say agencies have to resolve by a certain number of days, which what Susan and I would prefer as private practitioners. But that's likely to create a lot of pushback from the agencies. So the alternative is to say that if there's no decision within a certain number of days, as under the Contract Disputes Act, if there's no decision within a certain number of days, it's a deemed denial, and that would trigger the vendor to taking other action, for example, the GAO. But Susan had concerns, and I'd really like to hear her elaborate on those.
Susan.
I think that the issue of a certain number of days needs to be addressed, because my concern is one agency could say 35 days, another could say 60 days. You get different days. You have protesters not knowing, is it deemed, isn't it deemed, and confusion in general. I worry about that. You know what I mean? So I could live with a deemed denial as a trigger if it was a very precise day and everybody had the same day.
So
I just think it's going to be really onerous. And the risk is if there's a deemed denial and you're not aware of it, or you've missed a deadline because it takes too long.
That's another litigator's nightmare. So does the fact that we've already earlier said that the agency should clearly identify their procedures and timelines, does that reduce the heartburn here?
Maybe can we truncate like that last sentence and say agencies should clearly and immediately communicate when they have made a decision, period. A protest is deemed denied after a certain number of days without a decision.
Take that out, Susan.
Well, I mean, either take it out or leave in that a protest will be deemed denied after a certain number of days without a decision, and that number of days to be identified by the agency at the start of the protest.
Yeah, that's a good solution. That solves the problem of that solves both the problem of the black hole and also the if there's just a deemed denial buried in the rules, what Susan is getting at, I think appropriately, is that small businesses wouldn't be aware of that obscure rule.
Let's let Mark write that down, and then I have Eloise and Jim in the queue. Okay, Eloise?
I just wanted to note that in what's currently lines 91 and 92, we have that agencies should make best efforts to notify protesters of how the general timelines apply to their specific agency level protests, which means that the deemed denial should be incorporated into that. And so, the protesters would have that sense from the beginning. So I just want to remind us, since it's now been a while since we had those together, remembering that, does that solve your concern, or does that address your concern?
I think you're making it, but I think another way to do it is just a cut and paste, then move it into the previous paragraph.
Yeah, because if you leave it, it will just not happen in an agency set of guidelines. They won't tell you the period for deemed. They won't consider that.
All right, we'll circle back to this. Jim?
In the room. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I don't litigate, but I'm most certainly involved in a lot of litigation, either as a plaintiff or a defendant. And I get involved where the statutes say you must issue a rule by a date certain. And when the agency doesn't do it, we go up to the court. The agency says, Judge, we would like to do it. We simply did not have the resources, and we negotiate a new date. Is there this kind of pressure valve here, or relief valve in what we've written here?
And there would not be a GAO. GAO would likely say, no, there's been adverse agency action by inaction, but the Court of Federal Claims might well do that, might well send it back to the agency for resolution. They do that in contract disputes.
So they do have it. They have it now. Okay.
Yeah.
Everything's a lot mushier in the Court of Federal Claims, but they just make so much sense.
Okay, I understand.
If Judge Smith were on the line, were on the call, 20 years ago, I begged Judge Smith to put firm deadlines in the Court of Federal Claims rules in order to make the costs more containable for contractors. And the Court of Federal Claims decided not to do that for whatever reason.
Okay.
I said we're going to circle back to, I think, Eloise. What do you think?
Well, so I thought where we last left things was that Chris had said that he wasn't sure. I wasn't actually making a suggestion. I was just pointing out that we have already said in recommendation 5 that protesters should be notified of how the deadlines apply to their specific cases. And so this deemed thing would be communicated presumably under those rules. So I was really just making sure that Chris and Susan felt okay with it.
I mean, that's right. There is a little bit of redundancy here, but one is at a higher level of abstraction and one is specific. And I'm not sure. I like the specific point because I think we're saying something important here that maybe will get lost if we just talk about general timelines. But I don't know. You know what? This is what I propose. Mark, we're gonna need to clean this one up already because the red line is all goofy. Can you make a note when you go back and review this audio? Let's look about if there's a way that we can sync up 5 and 6 better, and we'll propose that language when we come back for our next meeting. Because I think we're saying the same thing twice, one more specific, one more general, but in different numbers. And I think a little bit of thinking we can tighten it up and make everybody happy. So let's save that when we're gonna go back to that. Let's do one more and then we'll be done for today. Unless it's really hard and then we'll just be done and we'll save it all for next time. Which one are we on now?
It's what is now 9.
That sounds really complicated. Let's not do that one next. Let's scroll down and see the last section. The publishing data, that's what we'll end with. Do we have any concerns about the data publication? This is a question for Chris. When you spoke with the agencies, was anybody concerned about this as an undue burden on their resources or anything like that? Because I think this is important. I think we should always try to get this to the extent that we can. I just don't want to, if this is a huge fight, I'd like to know it's going to be a huge fight.
No, and the shorthand in the community would be that this is what GAO does.
Okay. Susan, is that your sense too?
Yeah, I would say during the RAND report, that was one of the things that they pinged the agency for not tracking their agency protest data. And I think the community would really appreciate you putting in a request for them to accumulate and address that data.
Eloise?
Can we include a time frame? So like every year or something like that?
It's annual at GAO.
I like that.
Yeah. So to clarify, Aaron, we're not, what Susan and I are arguing is to line up GAO and the agency level bit of protest so the data is published in parallel. What that logically means is as GAO improves the data publication, which it will over time, so too there will be pressure for agencies to do the same thing. We're moving, the reform starts moving in sync.
Okay.
And there would probably be pressure to resolve agency protests faster so that it became a more desirable forum.
So language-wise, I think we're, unless I'm misreading the virtual room, I think we're all in a similar place directionally. We all agree on the thrust of what we're doing here. Is the language accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish? Is there something that we're missing that we'd like to add? Again, I cold called Ann earlier. I might cold call her again because she is our data collection expert. Is there something that you would like to see here that we don't have?
Maybe I can ask Chris, I've looked at these annual GAO reports, kind of, there's a little bit more in those reports. I mean, do we want to make it parallel here? I mean, maybe between the first and the second meeting, we could take a look. Or I could try to pull up one now.
No, I think GAO is also reporting on which agencies ignored GAO's recommendations. And that's something that I don't think necessarily fits with agency level protest, but I'm glad to see what else might be in there.
So can I give you a homework assignment? I'm already cold calling you. Between Chris and Ann, between this meeting and next, can you just give a review of the GAO stuff and see if there's anything else we want to add to this list?
Susan has her hand up.
All right, Susan?
I can tell you one of the things that's missing is you're limiting it just to adjudicated protests. Protests may not be adjudicated. They could be filed, but they could either be withdrawn or the agency could take, no action and then they've gone to another forum. So I think you want to capture how many were submitted, and then if they were not adjudicated, what was the reason for it?
And I like that. Ann has a comment.
We can talk more about this at the next meeting, but the GAO reports cases filed, cases closed, kind of how many are sustained on the merits, kind of a sustained rate. They have an effectiveness rate. It's interesting, the GAO distinguishes between, like, has the agency provided sort of any accommodation at all? This is less so, this is not as relevant, this is not relevant in the agency context, or maybe it is, but they discuss how many cases use ADR, what the success rate is with ADR, and then what percentage and number of cases provide a hearing.
So yeah, it sounds like this is something that, because we're coming to the end here. If and again, if you don't have time, man, we can figure it out, or our ACUS staff can. But I think it'd be helpful to look at what exactly the GAO reports, and we can see, to the extent that we can sync it up. I think that would be beneficial. At least we could look what it would look like if it was synced up, and then we could decide on a provision by provision basis if it makes sense. So between this meeting and next, let's look at the GAO. Somebody will look at the GAO, and we'll see how much we can borrow from them. Makes it easier, and we don't have to just come up with it on the fly either.
Yeah, I volunteer. Maybe Mark would be my, maybe someone in ACUS could also reach out to me, and we could work that out.
That's great. Yeah, happy to do that.
So Aaron, I'm glad to look at the issue raised in the first paragraph in the first recommendation regarding what would be excluded from bid protest jurisdiction if we follow the GAO and Court of Federal Claims model. Now, I just want to touch on something that John raised early on, which is incredibly important. The number of protests that are actually sustained by GAO are very low. The number of protests, and which result in a new competition and an award to the protester. As John was pointing out, you're much more likely to succeed as a protester if you can actually get in and talk to the agency, and the agency takes corrective action. At the end of the day, that's the strongest argument for making agency-level bid protests a legitimate, viable pathway, because that really facilitates that kind of communication between experienced protest counsel on both sides of the table.
All right, we have done a long session on a pretty technical field. I am very grateful to all of you. This has been awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I've learned a lot. Thank you for the wisdom of the group. We are done for now. What we're going to do is we will circle back with some more information. We have a few left, mainly the GAO stuff in the middle there, which we will talk about next time, and we'll go over the preamble and we'll update what we have. We're well on our way. We're almost there. Thank you, everybody. We have survived the first ever ACUS Zoom committee meeting, and I think everybody did a great job. So I'm done. Matt or Mark, do you have any concluding thoughts for us?
This is Matt. I have no concluding thoughts. I have one in addition to thanking you. Just keep in mind, I don't need to tell you this, Aaron, but for the benefit of others, the voting members of the committee will obviously have to approve each aspect, the recommendation with respect to both its particulars and its entirety. And it's possible that for the next meeting that we may have a new committee member or two, and that person's perspective and vote will have to be taken into account. I don't see that as any kind of obstacle, but I do want to just point that out.
All right, and with that, we are done. Everybody stay safe, and we will see you again on the 27th.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.